Good morning, Dog Nation. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're going to dive into all the news of the day here in just a moment. There is a lot of it. Georgia has added a coach on one side of the ball, and I guess you could say failed to add, so far anyway, coach on the other side of the ball. We'll kind of update you on what's happening on offense as Georgia has found its tight ends coach, and on defense where Georgia is still on the look for maybe a defensive coordinator, although there's certainly reason to believe that may be coming in-house sooner rather than later, but definitely a defensive backs coach. Kind of an interesting ride on the rumor train on that over the weekend. It's going to be a fun show. We're glad you're with us. Chip Towers later on as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
You know, I'll admit off the top of the show, I don't 100% know what to make of all of this. I'm not that worried about it, and I guess over the course of the next couple of minutes, I'm going to try to convince you of the same thing. What I am talking about is the rumor that you probably followed over the weekend involving Georgia's search for a defensive backs coach. Now, off the top, it's kind of interesting that that's what we're talking about as opposed to defensive coordinator. The rumor here, not even rumor, it was true. Corey Raymond talked to Georgia, interviewed for that job, apparently wasn't maybe offered the job, and then decided to go back to LSU, which was maybe his plan all along. Raymond is one of the best defensive back coaches in all of college football, not apparently, as our buddy Connor Riley was pointing out before the show started, not making a ton of money there in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They don't have probably, I guess, have a history other than, Dave Aranda's making all the money down there in Baton Rouge as it is. He's paid over $2 million a year, but one way or another, Corey Raymond, a very respected coach, a terrific recruiter, interviews at Georgia. Nothing comes of that interview, and he goes back to LSU. And to a lot of Georgia fans, there's a little bit of angst here because all of this stuff is now playing out in a very public fashion. You also had the weird rumors over the weekend with Charlton Warren, the Florida defensive backs coach, who was at one point in time reportedly in the mix for Georgia's defensive coaching job. DawgNation was able to refute that rumor and saying, no, that's not the case. Warren is not in the mix here at UGA. And more of this sort of public, is he or isn't he? What's going to happen next with all of this? Why hasn't Georgia hired a defensive coordinator? Maybe the more accurate phrasing, the longer this thing goes on, why hasn't Georgia officially promoted one of its in-house guys to defensive coordinator? And why hasn't Georgia hired a defensive backs coach as of yet? Social media and the advance of all that kind of stuff just makes some of this, in some cases, even more intense. But while it's kind of weird to watch some of this play out publicly, and I'll admit, I'm just, if Raymond is indeed not coming to Georgia, which I guess, coming off the weekend, that's the feeling that you get. I mean, I'll admit I'm a little disappointed. Raymond's a good coach. I don't know that it was necessarily all that reasonable to assume that a guy who's got that kind of ties, not just to the state of Louisiana, but the university, LSU, that Georgia could pluck him out of the state in a lot of ways. That's probably like trying to go in there and pull out a guy like, John Emery Jr. running back. But nonetheless, to think that you could go in there and do that may have been a little unrealistic. But as I was reacting with many of you on Saturday evening when this stuff started, popping up to the surface, I'll admit that name gets you excited. The impact that Raymond could make on UGA recruiting. What kind of coup it would be viewed as if Georgia could pull that off. And the fact that apparently it's going to fizzle into nothing and not happen, there's a little bit of a disappointment. But that disappointment shouldn't be registered on the part of Georgia fans as desperation on the part of UGA. And the concern or the curiosity about who Georgia is going to hire, I don't think should veer in the direction of panic, but the fact that as of yet, Georgia hasn't hired anyone for this role of defensive backs coach, hasn't promoted a defensive coordinator. As of yet, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Because remember, the thing that these guys are brought in here to do, whether it be the defensive coordinator or the defensive backs coach, really any coach on the Georgia roster, they're brought in to recruit. And here's the thing that if I can leave you with this for a moment off the top of our program as we begin our week here today on DawgNation Daily, I would leave you with this. Thus far, the recruiting process for Georgia in 2019 is going very well. And as you move towards the 2020 cycle and things like that, listen, it's going to be a while before Georgia needs any of these newly hired coaches to hit the ground running on any of this kind of stuff anyway. So let me give you a few examples here to maybe make you feel a little bit better about where all this is eventually going to go, even if we don't know where it's going yet, and even if we are, like me, admittedly a little disappointed that's not going to include a big-name guy like Corey Raymond. First of all, let me go back to December here for a moment. When, by this point in time, the news about, Mel Tucker is out there, the stuff's kind of going on, Georgia's looking to lock down its recruiting class, and you think about all the big names on defense that Georgia brought in, guys that you saw on these all-star games over the course of the last few days, going back to last weekend, 4-star safety Lewis Seen, 5-star linebacker N'Kobe Dean, 4-star linebacker Ryan Trouble Davis, 4-star linebacker Tresman Marshall. Blue chip guy, one right after the other that Georgia brought into its class here for 2019 to supplement the depth that Georgia already had. And as Kirby Smart also explained when he spoke to reporters there that day on the eve of the first day of the early signing period back in December, Georgia also identified one of the areas which it was not all that strong a year ago, and with a couple of its signees here for 2019, it thinks it is improved. So when you think about the fact that Georgia's currently missing some defensive coaches, don't let that obscure you from the fact that Georgia has a defense in 2019 that on paper, no matter who's coaching it, no matter what the coaching staff fully looks like here, on paper that looks pretty good, and some of these 2019 signees are a big reason why, including the area involving the pass rush. Georgia didn't sack the quarterback a lot last year. Kirby Smart believes that two of the guys they brought in December are going to potentially change that here, maybe even as soon as this season. For those of you worried about the lack of a defensive coordinator and the lack of a defensive backs coach, here's Kirby Smart to maybe make you feel better about some of the recruiting work this Georgia staff has already done here.
We certainly feel like we've dropped off in our speed on the edge from the Lorenzos and Davins and Leonard Floyds of the years to be able to get Jermaine and Nolan. I don't know that there's two better pass rushers in a signing class anywhere in the country when it comes to speed. Jermaine can run, Nolan can run, and these guys have got to help us disrupt quarterbacks, which we struggle with this year.
I mean, y'all know this. Kirby Smart does not throw compliments around, very freely and very easily. He keeps his thoughts close to the vest. So what would you rather have right now? A fully filled out defensive coaching roster, or as Kirby Smart describes, the best two pass rushing signees in the entire country as part of the same class in 2019? If I'm a Georgia fan, I'll take the latter more so than the former, and I appreciate Kirby Smart saying that. Now, your response back to that's going to be, but Georgia still doesn't have that defensive backs coach, and it needs one. It needs that blue-chip recruiter there in that position. It needs that guy to help develop and bring along the next DeAndre Baker. It needs to figure out and announce who its defensive coordinator is going to be. And you're not wrong about that. We talked about this on Friday, too, that there is that little bit of angst on the part of fans, and to be honest with you, in some circles, the media, because the media is just as curious as anybody about wanting to know what the eventual end of this story is going to be. But as I said on Friday, and I want to at least bring this back today because it's more relevant now that the Corey Raymond thing kind of fizzled out over the course of the weekend, the people who need to know, you've heard probably in old school movies before, the whole idea of being on a need-to-know basis. Well, in this case, the people who truly need to know are those recruits that are going to play for coaches, the ones that Georgia's about to hire. They're the ones whose opinion on this matters more than anything else. They're the ones whose feelings and mood needs to be managed more so than anything else. And let's go back to a few days ago now when 4-star defensive back Tyreek Stevenson made his announcement to come to Georgia and be a part of that 2019 class. Jeff Sintel had a chance to speak to him when it was all over. You may have heard this on Friday's show, but I wanted to bring it back again because it's relevant. Now, the audio quality on this is not great. There's a lot of stuff going on in the room where Stevenson's speaking. But listen to Stevenson speak about how well he thinks that he has been kept in the loop about the absence of a defensive backs coach at Georgia and the absence of a defensive coordinator at Georgia. So if you're worried about the fact that Georgia seems to have, failed to land a high-profile defensive backs coach like Corey Raymond, maybe Stevenson's words from a few days ago, before all of this played out, when there was even less known about this situation than there currently is now, maybe Tyreek Stevenson's words here can be a bit of a comfort to you. Here's Tyreek Stevenson.
Why was it Georgia?
Just me being comfortable with Coach Smart and trusting what he says, and, being comfortable with the team and the facility. So that's why with the Coach Tucker situation, they hit me up first. They let me know what was going on. And they told me don't panic. I trusted that. So them are factors right there.
I mean, listen, he uses the word comfortable twice, and that's a good feeling for a big-time defensive back like Stevenson. In the midst of some unknown situations here, unknown circumstances, how is Georgia going to fill out its defensive coaching staff? We don't know that yet. But even though Stevenson presumably doesn't know that either, although there's certainly a chance he knows more than us, but even though presumably he doesn't know that, he says, I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable with Coach Smart, the guy that's leading this entire organization. And if Stevenson feels that way, I would suggest that Georgia fans should feel that way too. And then just to kind of wrap all this up on a more lighthearted note, it's also important to remember who you're competing with for these elite players. I saw where another great defensive back, the four-star Kyrie Elam, took his official visit to Florida over the weekend, which, by the way, if there was ever a good time for those weird Charlton Warden rumors to pop up, even if they're not true, having those pop up while Kyrie Elam is visiting the Florida campus, the timing of that actually probably helped Georgia a little bit, even though, as it turns out, there probably weren't too much to this. But for those of you watching on video, this is going to translate better for you, but I want to mention it anyway. So Elam takes his visit to Florida, and you may remember the dance that Jaden Hazelwood did when he scored a touchdown in the All-American Bowl, or some of the stuff we've seen, around here. You see Kyrie Elam in kind of in his pose on his visit to Florida this weekend, and then you see Dan Mullen kind of doing the same thing here. Now, believe me when I tell you, now I know I'm biased here, but believe me when I'm telling you, and this may be one of those days, if you're listening on the radio or the podcast, you may want to find this for yourself. Dan Mullen looks like the biggest dork I have ever seen. You cannot pose like that if you're wearing those khaki pants. You just can't. I mean, this is one of the goofiest looking things I've ever seen. So given the choice of chasing down the elite talent that's still out there for the class of 2019, I'd rather have Georgia have no defensive backs coach and no defensive coordinator than have a head coach whose way of relating to players is doing the stuff that Dan Mullen gets caught on video doing. So I don't really quite know where that lands with you, but that's kind of where this is for me. I mean, the overall bottom line is, look, it'd be great to have this wrapped up. It'd be great to have this over and done. It'd be great to have what I think of as kind of an elite coach like Corey Raymond in the fold here, or Derek Ansley, who we've talked about and seemingly haven't heard about, kind of over the last few days. That'd be great to have any of that in place. Ultimately, that's not there yet, but Georgia fans shouldn't be all that worried about the timeline. I do believe Georgia will have coaches and quality coaches by the time it really needs them, sometime in the near future, I'm guessing. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you. Good to have you with us. As we said, live on video every day, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon, of course, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and in podcast form, wherever podcasts can be found. The Apple Podcast Player, the Google Podcast Player for the Android devices, the world-famous DawgNation.com, and much more. Good to have you with us. And I would love to see you in person tomorrow. I'd love to talk to you about all this kind of stuff and more. And if you want to be there, part of that, we love the interaction we're able to have online every day. But the best possible interaction is that face-to-face conversation and contact you can get at one of our Marlowe's Tavern broadcasts. Our countdown to signing day continues tomorrow, live at the Marlowe's in Buford. We have not been back in Buford in a while, and we are coming back tomorrow. What I like to think of as a triumphant return. It's 6 to 8 p.m. tomorrow. Marlowe's in Buford. Now, that's the Mall of Georgia location, so if you find the Mall of Georgia, you found the Marlowe's in Buford. The address, though, is 3333 Buford Drive, 6 to 8 p.m. Jeff Sintel's going to be there. A lot of inside skinny, behind-the-scenes scoop on the latest on the coaching search. I'm sure Jeff's got a lot on that, what recruits are telling him privately, and how Georgia fills out its remaining scholarship spots for its 2019 class. That's all with Jeff and you tomorrow at the Marlowe's in Buford, starting at 6 p.m. for our Countdown to Signing Day event. That is going to be a lot of fun. All right, we're going to get Chip Towers here in a moment. Before that, though, let's go around the doghouse here on Monday today, brought to you by Pella Window and Door. And I kind of started the show by addressing some of the defensive coaching stuff that didn't happen over the weekend. It's also important to note here on this Monday morning, a couple of hours ago now, something has happened for Georgia on the offensive side. Now, we talked about James Coley Friday afternoon. If you missed the regular That was sort of after the regular Dog Nation Daily went off the air. I'll do some more on that in just a moment. But Coley has been promoted to offensive coordinator. By now you're aware of that, even if it did not happen the last time we were speaking on the regular edition of Dog Nation Daily. But kind of filling out in place of that is Todd Hartley returning to UGA as tight ends coach. I thought that Kirby Smart had a nice statement to make about Hartley's return here. Let me read that to you here just for a moment as a part of Around the Doghouse presented by Pella Window and Door. Smart says, we expect Todd to be a great fit back at Georgia. He worked with the team while he was in school at UGA until he graduated and then returned to our program for another year later in his career in a separate role. So there's no doubting his allegiance and excitement about returning to join the Bulldogs. Todd has proven himself, and listen to this now, to be an excellent position coach and a top-notch recruiter. We look forward to his return to Athens. Kirby Smart's not going to miss that opportunity to talk about the importance of someone being a good recruiter. In this case, that's one of the things that Hartley brings to UGA, that sort of tenacity on the recruiting trail. Obviously, Georgia needs that at the tight ends position. And I look forward to seeing him fill out the rest of that coaching staff as the offensive stuff kind of falls into place here. As we said, James Coley promoted to offensive coordinator on Friday afternoon. I think this is a good move. Not every Georgia fan obviously is going to be in love with this. They wanted that splashy outside hire name. I don't think Georgia needs that. I think the Georgia offense was already in good shape. I think that Coley's one of the most coveted assistant coaches in college football. So much so that if you want to go back to last offseason, had a chance to go with his buddy Jimbo Fisher to Texas A&M. Georgia paid to keep him and then promoted him with his role. And in the spring, Kirby Smart, before the start of spring practice, talked about why maintaining that continuity with Coley was such an important thing and the impact he was going to be able to make on the Georgia coaching staff. Here's what Kirby said about James Coley, Georgia's new offensive coordinator, before the start of last year's spring practice.
I think Coley's done a tremendous job for us as a coach. He did a tremendous job with the receivers, very knowledgeable. He's a guy that's been a coordinator before. He's worked with quarterbacks. He's had success working with quarterbacks in his history, and that's something that I thought was a good move for our program. So he'll be co-offensive coordinator. He'll work with the quarterbacks.
So as we know now, it's no longer co-offensive coordinator. He's got that job for himself. Kirby Smart's also said some other things over the course of the last few months about James Coley. We'll update more of that a little bit later on as we kind of continue our conversation about a lot of this coaching stuff, including right now with Around the Doghouse presented by Pella Window and Door. Now, by the way, speaking of Pella Window and Door, one of the things I love about them is that's a locally owned company, but they're also backed by that big-time national brand. So you really get the best of both worlds when it comes to Pella Window and Door. They can help equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors. As I said, they're family-owned and operated with a branch right here in Georgia, which means you get local service backed by a national company, and they've also got a great offer for you right now. You can get 40% off qualifying installations or 0% APR for 60 months. That's an offer valid through February 7th, so make sure you check that out right now. 2 ways to get in contact with them. Check them out on their website at pellasoutheast.us. That's pellasoutheast.us, or give them a call in their Dunwoody showroom at 404-445-2979. That's 404-445-2979. Pella Window and Door of Georgia, they're viewed to be the best. We'll have more on the Coley promotion later on in the program. For now, though, let's get an update on what didn't happen for Georgia with its defensive coaching pursuit. Let's talk to Chip Towers right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Say hello to Chip Towers here, all over the stuff that's going on with the Georgia coaching search, the guys that Georgia has hired, the guys that as of yet Georgia hasn't hired. And, Chip, you've been around the block on these kinds of issues a lot over the years, so let me begin this way. Corey Raymond is a guy, speaking as a Georgia fan, that I would love to have had. I guess for a lot of Georgia fans, though, the fact that Georgia apparently is not going to get him, a lot of Georgia fans would have preferred not to hear about it at all, if that's going to be the case. Do you think it's a bad thing for UGA that some of this kind of stuff is playing out publicly? The fact that Georgia, in some form or fashion, had some contact with Eddie Gran, who's going to stay at Kentucky's offensive coordinator, that Georgia, in some form or fashion, whether an offer was extended or not, has had some contact with Corey Raymond. We've learned about this kind of stuff, and it sort of fizzled into nothing. Is it bad that this is playing out publicly?
Well, no, I don't think so, Brandon. I mean, it's just the age we live in. Look, this is called the silly season for a reason. It's been around forever. The only difference now is just, the advent of social media and the way things are covered are just a little bit different. I mean, but this is always what's going on this time of year. Probably the biggest difference is that National Signing Day the complexion has changed considerably, and a lot of this stuff was kept on the shelf, until after National Signing Day. Now, since most of your class is signed at the end of December, you see much more activity in January, and then a lot of it surrounding the AFCA Coaches Convention in mid-January, where a lot of contacts are made and stuff like that. And I would kind of say with Corey Raymond, I don't know this 100%, but generally when stuff gets out, it's because the other side wants it out, right? Because it's in their best interest. And, it's hard a lot of times to distinguish between truth and fiction. In a lot of cases, contact has been made, and in some cases, actual offers aren't made. Sometimes the details of that offer aren't exactly what you think, or what they may be made out to be on the other side. But Corey Raymond is a guy who was, who wouldn't want to have the godfather of DBU as your DB's coach, right?
Sure.
But you talk about a guy that is, dyed in purple and gold, and is just, resident Louisiana through and through, a native of New Iberia, Louisiana, and LSU letterman. And if you read on the LSU side of things, maybe the door is not completely closed on that at this point or not. I'm not sure, but in any case, I always saw it as a bit of a long shot that you'd be able to get Corey Raymond out of Louisiana.
Yeah, that's a good point. The door, I guess, could be open here. There seems to be the strong suggestion that Georgia's still in the process of interviewing a lot of guys and things like that. But I wouldn't ask you to betray a source or anything like that. But are we to assume something that you kind of touched on as well, that when something like this does become public, school trying to hire coach, trying to talk to coach, and when it becomes public, 99.9% of the time, it comes public because of the coach releasing it, because obviously it benefits that coach to be sort of thought of in a big public light here. Should we most of the time assume this stuff is coming from the coach itself?
Yeah, well, look, we know, if you know nothing else about Kirby Smart, it's that, he's a singular voice message guy, and he keeps everything really, really tight, and really the only people who are, completely privy to who's been offered what, are Kirby Smart and Greg McGarity, who has to approve whatever kind of money and contract situations you may be talking about. And look, here's the thing, what's happening, and in a lot of cases, Kirby's trying to keep all his options open, right? So, a lot of people, I still think Dan Lanning is eventually going to be part of this entire, defensive, senior administration, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I think that's part and parcel. You're trying to get a DB's coach, and out of the pool of DB's coach that you're talking to, that may or may not have to come with a title. It depends just on what you can negotiate into the situation and what you need to negotiate. Corey Raymond's a guy who's making $410,000 at LSU and doesn't have any type of title. That makes him, in today's market, sort of vulnerable. But, he's going to go back with whatever Georgia offers to him to LSU and tell them that, hey, this is what they offered me. And they're going to either raise him or give him a title, or you're deciding whether he needs to be defensive coordinator or defensive coordinator. Now, here's the reality on Corey Raymond. He's not known in Louisiana for his own field coaching abilities. I'm just saying reputation. I don't know. I've got no way to judge that, but I just say, I know a lot of people on the Louisiana beat for a long time, and they got a safeties coach there who shares responsibilities with him. So this is not an X and O guy. This is a recruiting guy. So what do you want? You want a recruiting guy to coordinate your defense, or you want a recruiting guy to coach your defensive backs? I don't know. Kirby's got to work all that out. That's why he gets paid the big bucks.
Yeah, it certainly seems interesting that when you hear about all this stuff lately, it seems like it's, more about that defensive backs coaching role more so than the defensive coordinator role as it stands right now. And I guess I was going to, kind of take the conversation this way anyway. The longer this goes on, it certainly seems more likely to me that the coaching hire is for a defensive backs coach, and that one of the guys already on staff gets promoted to some version of the defensive coordinator, whether it's a co-DC or not. That seems sort of the next step in this process, right? That it's more likely than not that the defensive coordinator is a promotion from within, and the outside guy becomes the defensive backs coach, which isn't an insignificant hire. But doesn't that seem like where all this is heading, Chip?
No, that's exactly what I would say is where it's heading, and some of that you can kind of gauge some of the announcements on that. Of course, Kirby announces Todd Hartley today as the tight ends coach after talking to a number of individuals about that position. And again, that was why you were holding off on James Coley. If you end up, if an Eddie Grant or a Dan Enos ends up coming in to coach your tight ends, does that come with a co-title with James Coley or not? Depends on whatever it takes to leverage those guys to get there. As it turns out, they got Todd Hartley. They locked it up. Todd Hartley, very familiar with Georgia through and through, a Georgia guy, a double dog, been here before, out of work right now. So you kind of had some leverage on him. But I mean, coaches tight ends and has coached a lot of special teams. Probably a really good fit for Georgia, as Kirby Smart says. You announce that now after you've exhausted all your other possibilities. Where it comes on Georgia's defensive backs, you still have National Signing Day around the corner. You're not going to announce that hire unless it behooves your recruiting on National Signing Day. If it doesn't, you'll just wait till afterward. I mean, Kirby's not in a rush on this situation unless he's got some boffo news to share, not just with the public, but with Georgia's recruits. And he's probably working pretty feverishly behind the scenes to get that wrapped up.
So let me ask you about that. And I do think the timing of a lot of these announcements is really interesting. I have to admit that I thought it was interesting on Friday. Now, I don't believe the sort of the Kentucky spin on the Eddie Grant situation. I don't believe that. That rumor started in Kentucky. It ended in Kentucky. I think that tells you everything you want to know about the fact that, whatever level of interest that Georgia may have had in Eddie Grant. That whole thing felt like it was a yarn being spun from the get-go. But, shortly after the Eddie Grant thing, and then you got Dan Enos, who AL.com had reported, being in the mix for Georgia. He takes the Miami job, and then right after that, Georgia, announces the promotion of James Coley. Do you think there's something interesting to the way that the Coley promotion was announced right after Enos left Alabama as the quarterback's coach to take the Miami job? Or in your mind, is that likely just a coincidence?
No, I think it's all related, Brandon. And this is what makes it so intriguing, the whole thing playing out before us. But here's the bottom line, okay? Sometimes you got to sort of wade through the narrative that you get during coaching carousel season, to find the logic, right? James Coley was always going to be part of Georgia's offensive coordinator situation. He had a co-title with James, with Jim Chaney, who, coincidentally did not have a co on his title. That was kind of key to the whole setup on there. Jim Chaney was in charge, but James Coley was right there as coordinator in the press box, in the coach's box, in the meeting room, helping design the play script and all that. You don't keep him, you doubled his salary the year before and made him co-offensive coordinator to keep him from going to Texas A&M, to be the solo, Texas coordinator for Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher. So so a year later, you're not just going to bring somebody in with a whole new system and then hire them over James Coley. So yes, I think all that was part and parcel of Enos and Grant and whatever conversations they had. What Georgia had, the reality, was a tight ends position and possibly a co-coordinator. That's what they had available. That's what Kirby had available at his disposal. Enos gets full coordinator down at Miami. That makes sense. And Grant gets it was already full-time coordinator at Kentucky. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
The bottom line was James Coley was always going to be part of this situation, and I think that's something that Kirby saw really going all the way back to when he brought him into Georgia. You had an overqualified wide receivers coach when James Coley showed up from Miami in the first place, and he's taking care of his guy, who's taking care of him by recruiting South Florida like a banshee,
Yeah, no, I think that what you're saying is really interesting. You use a very important word, which is overqualified. James Coley was not a typical position coach in that he had been a kind of standalone offensive coordinator, going back to his time at Miami, and also before that had been involved in a lot of the offensive stuff, taking place at previous jobs. This is a pretty big time, assistant coaching candidate for any program that could acquire him. I think they would view that as kind of a major coup. The fact that Georgia can promote him, I think, is a good thing here. And, Chip, it goes back to something that, as you might imagine, we've talked about a lot on the show over and over again, which is the fact that Kirby Smart's actually been satisfied with the Georgia offense. Some Georgia fans wanted a complete overhaul because they didn't like Jim Chaney, but Kirby looks at the overall statistical picture and says, you know what, this offense is actually getting it done, which is another reason why Coley was always heading for some sort of promotion, because whether Chaney stayed or not, Kirby wanted to maintain the status quo, which is an offense that he thinks is really getting it done based on the game plan that Georgia's trying to achieve.
Yeah, I love what Jim Chaney, just sort of humbly said at the Sugar Bowl press conference, where he said, last time I checked, 39 points a game, 39 a click is pretty good. Talking about Georgia's scoring average, I mean, nearly 40 points a game, and look, Kirby and the coaching community knows that. Fans, and this is not unique to Georgia. Fans, they never like the play caller, right? I mean, because it's a 50-50 shot that any play works that you call, and there's the added idiosyncrasies of whether you're checking in and out or whatever got called. That's never, you cannot judge the position by that. Offensive coordinator, more than any other position, has to be judged on scoring, yardage, third down conversions, efficiencies, things like that. Or what tell you what the job your offensive coordinator is doing. And Georgia's through the roof. I mean, Georgia's top third at least. I'm probably not giving them a top quarter, consistently, the last 3 years in those overall offensive statistics, and in the top 10 nationally. So it's just like, it's really silly. I mean, Jim Chaney's good at what he does. He didn't want him to leave. This is what happens in this business. Tennessee, what it comes down to most of the time is a need factor, and Tennessee was a desperate when it came to Jim Chaney in the need factor. They were through the roof. That's why you're paying him, making him one of the highest paid offensive coordinators in America. Georgia was willing to do something to get Jim Chaney to stay because they love what's going on and the consistency. But at the end of the day, there's got to be a line of demarcation, and they crossed it with the final raise on that. And it's like, hey, James Coley could do the job. All right, let's see what we do. What can we do now? How can we better the staff now? And that's what Kirby's always looking to do. He's had multiple options, whatever it takes, co-coordinator, assistant head coach. These titles are really not as important as roles on the team. You'll do whatever you can with titles to get people to join your staff.
So let me finish with this. You mentioned Todd Hartley before, and I think most people are going to celebrate this as a pretty good hire by Georgia because there's another guy that knows his way around the recruiting world a bit and has also got some pretty significant ties to Georgia, as you touched on. But in terms of the actual specific coaching role he's going to fill, tight ends is a big issue for Georgia going forward. Georgia loses Isaac Nauta to the NFL draft. Georgia loses Luke Ford to transfer. Georgia's got to rebuild that position. Now, Charlie Werner as a number one tight end, you certainly got no beef there, but Georgia plays a lot of two tight end sets, Chip, as you know, and as of right now, who that second tight end for Georgia is either unclear or currently not on the roster, and there's also the issue of Georgia fans who want to see the tight end used more. Obviously, recruiting is the name of the game, but the on-field coaching when it comes to how tight ends are going to be developed and used during games, that's a pretty curious issue for Georgia moving forward in 2019, is it not?
Yeah, and I suppose if I had to guess, and again, this is just a guess, BA, but I mean, I would imagine that has something to do with the timing, on Todd Hartley. And look, he's not the type of hire that, nationally everybody's going to go, whoa, look who Georgia got. But that's a very experienced guy that not only, has, deep Georgia ties, but, I mean, he also has experience at West Virginia, Marshall, and Miami, and has been involved quite intimately in the recruiting game. In fact, it was in the recruiting game that he attracted Mark Richt's attention as just a student assistant back in the mid-2000s when he was working for him, and they had a interim situation where he was having to go out on the road and recruit, and, he showed quite an acumen for it. But the reality is, you're right, Georgia's tight end situation is suddenly a pretty big concern. And it's not, Charlie Warner's going to do a good job, and I'm sure John Fitzpatrick eventually is going to develop into a solid tight end like all of them are. But depth is a real concern, especially going into this spring, because you got Rollins. Is it Goad or Good?
Goody,
Goody. Okay. So you got him coming in, but he's coming off a knee injury. He's not going to be able to help you in spring. I mean, these guys are going to need oxygen tanks out there because Georgia does use the tight end role a lot. So I suspect, they needed Todd Hartley announced and him on the road so he can go and get in some living rooms of some tight end prospects, whether they be high school or I would imagine this is a situation that you're going to have to look to junior college for some immediate help. And I'm sure these guys that are out there, anybody who's out there might be available. Their biggest question right now is going to be who's coaching me. So they needed to get somebody out there and where they can stand in front of them in flesh and blood now that we're in the open period and say, hi, I'm your tight ends coach, and I'm looking forward to coaching you when you come to Georgia. In a lot of cases, that'll probably be all it takes. I would imagine we'll see some recruiting news coming from Jeff Stentel in fairly quick order to address that situation.
Yeah, Chip, no doubt about that. It's certainly a wild time with a lot of this stuff late breaking and developing over the course of the day. We appreciate your coverage of it all. We'll look forward to reading a lot more from you at DawgNation.com. And, of course, we'll enjoy having you back here again on DawgNation Daily very soon as well.
Looking forward to it. See you next time.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Really good stuff from Chip Towers on the coach that Georgia has hired, Todd Hartley. The coach that Georgia has not hired as of yet, its defense backs coach, its defensive coordinator. Announcement's not coming there. As Chip reminded you, maybe don't completely close the door here on Corey Raymond either in terms of what might happen later on in that regard. Some of this stuff is playing out publicly, some of it's not. We'll keep following all of it. But, as I said, for me, the overall takeaway is how this impacts recruiting. And as you head towards the conclusion of the 2019 cycle, I don't know that there's a lot of evidence that's going to have a negative impact on Georgia one way or another. As Tyreek Stevenson so eloquently explained, he feels like that he was kept in the loop and he was comfortable with the situation where it was. My guess is some of the other guys that Georgia may be chasing down, they may very much feel the same way there in that regard. So we shall follow that, see where it goes. Before we do our SEC through here, and there's some pretty interesting SEC stuff to get to, let me remind you of a great offer from our friends at Kroger. Right now, you can earn 3 times the fuel points on hundreds of items throughout your local Atlanta Kroger store, including all bakery cookies, floral plants, and pet items. It's right now through January 22nd, so visit your local Kroger today and earn 3 times off the fuel points. Really good stuff there. Make sure you check that out. All right, SEC through time now, and there is the report out there, and I guess it's on its way to being official, that Steve Sarkisian, most recently the Atlanta Falcons offensive coordinator, was going to go to the Arizona Cardinals and be offensive coordinator for Cliff Kingsbury, who just got that job. Looks like now that's not going to happen. Bruce Feldman and others indicate, I guess, is it Diana Rossini from ESPN, was she the first one to report this, that Sarkisian's not going to Arizona. He's coming back to Alabama, where he worked as an analyst for a year and offensive coordinator for 1 game, having been a part of the effort that lost to Clemson back in 2016. Couple quick takeaways from this, which I think are really interesting. If you look on message boards or Twitter, Alabama fans don't want any part of this, which is hilarious to me. Because what it goes to show you is that you'd be hard-pressed to find any offensive coordinator that's really all that popular. Jim Chaney wasn't popular at Georgia. He wasn't popular at Tennessee before he came to Georgia. I mean, years before. That wasn't his most recent job. There was all this scuttlebutt last week of, is Eddie Gran going to leave Kentucky and go to Georgia? There are a bunch of message boards out there like, good, I hope he does leave. Sarkisian, who was an NFL offensive coordinator last year, would be an NFL offensive coordinator this year. Alabama has apparently swooped in to get him. Alabama fans are saying, I don't want any part of this guy. Now, the reason why they feel that way is because of what happened in 2016 when they lost to Clemson. That was not a good offensive game plan that night, I don't believe, for Alabama necessarily. But here's the one thing about this that's also pretty curious to me. There are a lot of Alabama fans who want to view the scenario with their program as if Nick Saban can do no wrong. The 2016 thing, I don't think you blame Steve Sarkisian for being inserted for an offensive coordinator for just 1 game. Remember, that was the example of Nick Saban sort of deciding that Lane Kiffin had worn out his welcome. He was on the way out the door, so Saban kind of pushed him all the way out. He went on to be Florida Atlantic head coach. A lot of Alabama fans, apparently Saban included, were unhappy with the offensive game plan against Washington, the game that was right here in Atlanta in the Peach Bowl, the college football playoff. That, to me, was always Nick Saban tinkering with the program too much, a little too micromanaging, a little too hands-on. If you want to look at the failure of 2016, not that that needs to be relitigated, that was more of a Saban issue of being just all too controlling and domineering, more so than Steve Sarkisian. I actually believe the Sarkisian hire is a pretty good one. I think the failure of years past belongs to Saban more so than it belongs to Sarkisian. And frankly, this just goes to show you the power of Alabama, that they can go into the NFL and bring a coach like this, back down to their ranks. And, more likely than not, this is a pretty good hire. It's also worth pointing out that Alabama's had a different offensive coordinator every year going back. 2016 would have been the last year they had the same offensive coordinator 2 years in a row. So from that standpoint, they've sort of gotten used to replacing these guys as it is. So there is that. Another piece of news involving Alabama is that now it is a total of 7 juniors that have moved on to the NFL draft after Lindell Mack Wilson has made his announcement there in that regard. Of all of the potential juniors, who could have declared for the NFL draft from Alabama, only 2 have decided to stay. You recently had Deontay Thompson decided to move on. Raekwon Davis did come back. That was probably the big name. And then Trevin Diggs staying as well. So Alabama has lost a lot of juniors. So for the Georgia fans who were kind of panicked the other day because Georgia lost 4, Alabama lost 7. Now, Alabama fans are just as panicked about that as Georgia fans were. Once again, the Alabama message boards, for the most part, are indistinguishable from the Georgia message boards like our forum at forum.dawgnation.com. Panic has a way of being easily fostered anytime something happens that's seemingly bad news. But for programs like Alabama and Georgia who've recruited really well, there's just always going to be a byproduct of guys going to the NFL early, which it's good news for Georgia when that happens because it opens up more spots. And really, for Alabama, it's kind of the same thing. You want people cycling through pretty quickly. Speaking of quickly, let me try to also go through 2 other stories pretty quickly here just for a moment. Jalen Hurts, speaking of Alabama, looks like he's visited 3 spots. He's been to Oklahoma. I believe Maryland in the mix there as well. And then most recently, Miami. All 3 of these situations make some sense. Oklahoma needs a quarterback, and that's a pretty attractive landing spot for quarterbacks right now. Loxley is at Maryland, the former Alabama offensive coordinator. He knows Jalen well. And then Dan Enos, his quarterbacks coach from Alabama last year, is also at Miami. So it looks like the Jalen Hurts situation is heading for a resolution sooner rather than later. In some cases, I believe classes at Oklahoma actually start this week. So this may be on its way to wrapping up here pretty soon. And speaking of wrapping up, we'll wrap up our SEC through by also mentioning this. Georgia committed quarterback John Rice Plumlee. Now, Georgia's got 3 scholarship quarterbacks right now because of DeJuan Mathis' signing and because of the signing of Stetson Bennett as a scholarship player back in December. But the one that did not sign is John Rice Plumlee. He's from the state of Mississippi, and over the weekend, he does visit Mississippi State. If you're watching on video, I'll show you this on Twitter, give you a chance to see it. John Rice Plumlee visiting Starkville, Mississippi, indicating that he had a great time out there. He says, I enjoyed my official visit to Mississippi State. Now, as our buddy Connor Riley points out, the uniform they gave him to wear is actually pretty small here. It almost looks like one of those, junior uniforms that you'd buy at like a toy store or something like that. But nonetheless, John Rice Plumlee showing off the maroon and white on official visit this past weekend. And we'll see what his status with Georgia is like as Georgia tries to fill out the best class it can with John Rice Plumlee being offered the blue shirt opportunity at UGA. We'll follow that and make that your SEC through. Okay, here on DawgNation Daily, there are a couple of things I'm going to try to do before we wrap up. I do need to go back in time for a second, though, and address, we were talking about the James Coley situation near the top of our program today, and I thought that Chip Towers was really good on this. James Coley's one of the best, most highly regarded assistant coaches in the country. Georgia had him, and therefore you want to keep him, and the way that you do that is by promoting him. And in terms of why he was viewed as a favorable candidate for the Georgia offensive coordinator job, Kirby Smart talked about this in August. It was still going to be Jim Chaney calling the plays for Georgia, but in terms of the overall influence on the Georgia offense, as Kirby explained back then before the season kicked off, Coley and many of the highly regarded assistants had already had a strong influence on how the overall offensive philosophy of Georgia looked. Coley had already been impactful there, and that's one of the reasons why he's been promoted to offensive coordinator right now. Here is a reminder of what Kirby said about Coley going back to the summer.
I don't know that you can say Coley's going to have more of an impact on the offense because he had a huge impact last year. So it would be misspoken to say, oh, okay, now we're going to have this premonition. No, it's the same offense. We've got Cortez bringing ideas in. We've got ideas formulated by what we did in off-season studies. So the building of the package is really based on what we have. What are our strengths? Are we stronger at receiver than running back, or are our backs going to be as good and as explosive as they were last year? We got to see some of that and see. But the way the offensive game plan's built will be very similar. We just have more input because we got one more coach. And the way it's called will be very similar to how it was called last year with Jim calling it from the box.
Yeah, so listen, I think that what you hear from Kirby Smart there going back this summer was an offensive philosophy and plays that Kirby Smart's very comfortable with. Jim Chaney was the guy tasked with doing that a year ago. I don't think Kirby Smart expects any drop-off, nor does he want any drop-off transition to James Coley right now. I believe the Georgia offense is still going to be in pretty good hands. Let me also give you a piece of breaking news here. According to the UGA Alumni Association, the date for G-Day is now set, so you can mark this on your calendar. April 20th, that particular Saturday, Georgia will host its annual spring scrimmage. April 20th is G-Day. That is officially set here as we're doing this live here. This just comes out. The spring schedule typically in flux for all these programs around the SEC. They have some flexibility about when they practice, also when they host their spring games. A lot of that determined by TV, but in this case, Georgia has now set its day. That's April 20th. No, that is not Master Saturday for those of you who were curious and concerned about that. That is the situation there. Let me also say, as we get ready to wrap up our program today, that, yes, I did see over the course of the weekend some of the stuff that Jaden Hazelwood had to say. I didn't want to spend a ton of time on this on the program today. I saw what Hazelwood said in the interview that he was a part of on streaming video, and I saw his tweet where he kind of clarified some of that kind of stuff. This all goes back to, I guess, his assertion that Georgia coaches were, he described them as used car salesmen, not on the, fully, on the record with him about, how they wanted to use him on that. He seemed to reference the departure of Jim Chaney's reason for saying those things. The honest truth is, at this point in time, I really don't care. Hazelwood seemingly doesn't like George and decided to move on. My only point here is I just wish him well in that regard. For the most part, I think that Georgia has done a pretty good job of moving on from him. Maybe it might be a good idea for Hazelwood to not move on from Georgia. Also point out this, that Georgia's done a pretty good job of establishing a brand for itself around something else, which is running the football, and that's a nice thing to see. By the way, 807 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten Georgia. We'll end on that good news and see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily. And wow, a lot going on today, and we didn't even get it all in that we planned to get in, but nonetheless, we tried our best to squeeze it all in, and I guess we'll have more shows later on in the week to get the rest of it in, and we're just glad to have you with us and give you a chance to respond to everything going on today. We've got a nice pocket of time here to do some comments, and so we'll get ready to do some of that kind of stuff. And Mark Cochran says on the subject of Jaden Hazelwood, I don't think he was coming here anyway, to be honest. He can say what he wants, but he did celebrate Georgia when we beat Oklahoma. Yeah, Mark, I think it's fair to say that somewhere along the way, Hazelwood changed his mind from where he was as a junior in high school, sophomore in high school, to where he was as a senior. And listen, that kind of thing happens a lot. We all evolve opinions over the course of time. Hazelwood certainly seemed to sour on the University of Georgia. That's the one thing that I guess would make me a little uncomfortable if I was an Oklahoma fan. Is how much of this is an issue of Hazelwood really liking Oklahoma, and how much of this is an issue with him just deciding he just didn't like Georgia, because at a certain point Miami became an unreasonable landing spot because of the turmoil with its coaching search. Florida State, for some different reasons, probably wasn't an easy place to sign up to going there as well. Is Oklahoma the school just by a default option? If I was a Sooners fan, I will admit that I'd be a little uncomfortable about that. All right, let me get some more comments and pop over to the YouTube side of things just for a second and get some reaction here to some of the things happening on today's show.
One thing on Hazelwood, my take.
Here's Connor Riley, by the way.
To quote Albus Dumbledore, it does not do to dwell on the past.
Was that a Harry Potter reference?
That is a Harry Potter
I am
reference.
not well-versed in the Harry Potter universe. I will admit something here, and I'm not necessarily proud of this, but I guess at least I caught myself before I thought better of it. I'm a big believer that adults like me should not tweet at recruits. Now, occasionally I've sort of tweeted a congratulations thing, or I've probably retweeted a recruit and commented on that before, but in terms of tweeting at the recruit, I try to be very careful not to do that. When Hazelwood tweeted his thing, and I think it's Saturday that came out, I had to like slam on the brakes. I almost did the new phone who dis thing to Hazelwood. And I thought, that's kind of funny, and it kind of gets the point that Georgia fans have moved on, but it's also probably veering the direction of having tweeted at a recruit. So let me just sort of not do that. So I did pump the brakes on that. Jack Leard says he likes the tight end coaching hire. Yeah, when you look at the overall resume of Todd Hartley, a guy that knows Georgia well, a guy that knows recruiting well. I mean, I think everything about that looks like a pretty good deal here. Shane Bentley says the negative turn with Fields led to Hazelwood decommitting. Shane, I believe you're probably right about that. I think there are two guys that decided they did not like Georgia, and while they're not going to play with each other, I think that relationship between Fields and Hazelwood made them both decide they didn't want any part of UGA. Robert Austin says that Kirby's losing credibility. I'm assuming this is reference to the coaching deal here. And, I don't believe that's true. And, as I said before, if you look at the way a lot of this stuff plays out in college football, pretty much all fans respond the same way. There was this nature of panic of, oh my gosh, Georgia's got 4 juniors going to the NFL. What does that say about the program, the fact that players don't want to be there anymore? And I think what we said here was, listen, if you've got the choice of playing the NFL for money or playing in Georgia for free, if you've got the opportunity, a chance to go play in the pros is the better overall offer. Alabama fans, when they see Lindell Mack Wilson and 6 other players move on to the NFL draft, it's the same level of panic. Oh my gosh, what does this mean that these guys are leaving the program? Is this all in reference to the disaster that was the national championship game? Do these guys not want to play for Tosh Lapoy? You're hearing some of that coming out of Alabama circles right now. The truth is that's probably not true either, which brings me back to the point about the coaching search. Oh my gosh, Georgia interviewed Corey Raymond, and he went back to Baton Rouge, and as it stands right now, it looks like he's staying in LSU, although I guess the door is still somewhat open there in that regard. Georgia's, working to hire its coaching staff. This is not going well. At this point in time, it's becoming embarrassing. You got to hire somebody. Every fan base reacts the same way when this kind of stuff's going on. I mean, literally every fan base, every single time, for time immemorial. Any SEC team that's ever in the position to make one of these coaching hires. Tennessee fans were doing that before they hired Jim Chaney. Alabama fans were doing that before they hired Nick Saban. You can go point to a lot of these examples where it's panic, and then it all just kind of works out. I really don't think that social media criticism counts as criticism. That you can look and see, Georgia being ripped by opposing fans on Twitter or something like that for not having a coaching hire. But once the hires are locked down, this is all going to just sort of be easily forgotten and be water under the bridge. I believe it's actually our buddy Dan Wolken, who we're occasionally pretty critical of here on DawgNation Daily, who said this the other day. When it comes to the way that opposing fans, Kentucky fans, Tennessee fans, Florida fans, when it comes to a lot of this kind of stuff, I think Wolken's phrasing was, it's all seemingly wishful thinking. There's a wish out there that the departure of Dan Enos and the departure of Josh Gaddis and the departure of 7 juniors the NFL draft. There's a wish out there that this sort of is the first, remnants of the fall of Alabama. And the SEC East, it's the same thing. Eddie Gran going public with his own version of events involving his contact by Georgia. Jim Chaney leaving for Tennessee for a king's ransom. That's all, evidence of Georgia's eventual demise as the consecutive winner of the SEC East. That's also seemingly a little wishful thinking on the part of the people who are trying to speak that into existence. If you're a Georgia fan, my encouragement here is, just reject all of that. Now, I don't say this on behalf of Georgia. It's not my job to carry the water for them. But it is my job to be honest with you about the way that I feel. And there are things that would make me really concerned as a Georgia fan. Thus far, none of the stuff that happened is something that would actually kind of get me all that worked up necessarily. Jack Leard says, was Chaney known as a recruiter? No, that was never really Chaney's strong suit. Not really involved in the recruiting process, one way or another too much. He says, if that's the case, then Tennessee messed up. maybe so. Maybe they need that extra offensive recruiting voice, considering the fact that Pruitt's strength's more on the defense. Robert Arson says there's no panic. We just can see how the program is turning upside down. I don't know about that. Double R says, BA, the way that Sony and Gurley are looking the playoffs, it has to have an impact on Milton Evans. What do you think? Yeah, I was going to try to talk more about that, and I just flat out ran out of time. I just, some days you just try to get too much into a show. But, one of the things that's important to know with, like Jaden Hazelwood saying what he said and, how he feels, and in some ways the Hazelwood dissatisfaction with Georgia seemingly representative of the larger feeling among elite wide receivers, it's important to note that the Georgia brand is stronger than ever when it comes to those running backs. And Zach Evans and Kendall Milton, yeah, I'm guessing they probably are paying close attention. I know that Connor wrote about this for a Good Day UGA this morning. Gurley looked great on Saturday night. Sony Michel just really, really toting a rock for New England yesterday. Gurley had a great tweet about how, choosing Georgia was the best decision he ever made. And, Georgia can use that. And I think the guys that are left at Georgia, the running back position for 2018, are going to kind of carry that baton more as well. DeAndre Swift, the return to health for Zamir White, the development of James Cook, who's also needing to return to health right now. That particular element of the Georgia brand has never seemed stronger, and that's a really good piece of news. Yes, Connor.
Just a thing, because I wrote about this and found a very interesting stat. The 4 teams that won this weekend are advancing to the conference championship game. They all outrushed the opposing team by at least 80 yards.
Yeah.
Running the ball is how you win football games.
Well, now, so here is the one. I don't mean to be a wet blanket on that stat, because I think it's a very interesting stat. But I also think you got to be careful with stuff like that from time to time, because there's the idea that running teams win. I think in the NFL, what you see sometimes the notion that winning teams run. In other words, when you build a big lead, now you are running the football a little bit more. That it's the teams that run because they're winning more so than the teams that win because they're running.
I would counter with over this weekend, the Rams won because of their running game. They ran for 270
Sure.
yards. The Patriots got out to a big lead because the Chargers couldn't stop Sony Michel in the first half. He was the first player in at least the last 25 years to rush for 100 yards and 3 touchdowns in the first half. The Saints were able to put away the Eagles because they were able to consistently run the football in the second half of that game, which the Eagles were not able to do.
Yeah, so, and as John William Adams points out, how great would it be if Gurley and Sony Michel were to meet up in the Super Bowl? I know for a lot of Falcons fans who live in Atlanta, they'd love the idea of Gurley doing that, because that means the New Orleans Saints are kept out of Mercedes-Benz Stadium, but it does really increase that brand. And I think, as Connor points out, when you see those teams have that success at the NFL level, it also reminds you of what Georgia can do in terms of its own pursuit of a national championship. That if there were teams out there that could build the offensive line that Georgia has, they would. If there were teams that could acquire the running backs that Georgia has required and likely will require in the future, they would. The development of the spread offense, the proliferation of the hurry up, no huddle, that's really a response to the fact that the kinds of assets that Georgia has in its possession are such rare commodities that most teams just assume they're never going to get them. Therefore, you have to come up with an alternative version of an offense to succeed, knowing you're not going to get those things that can matter more than anything else: dominant offensive linemen and dominant running backs. But there's virtually no team that would turn down what Georgia's been able to develop. If you could get those big offensive linemen, and if you could get those elite running backs, that's what you would want to get, because not only do they give you a chance to win every game, they give you a chance to win the majority of your games in easy fashion. If you're a coach and your livelihood's on the line, you are not going to turn down a chance to win games easily. D.H. Hatcher also reminds us, though, that if the Saints make the Super Bowl, that means Ben Watson's on his way there for the final game of his career, and that's a pretty good thing. Yarnell Culler says, I couldn't watch Sony because I don't watch the Patriots. However, I cheered for Gurley throughout the game. Yeah, Yarnell, that kind of goes back to last April when we talked about this a good bit more. For the majority of NFL fans, the most hated team is the Patriots. Now, there are, as a lot of people point out, there are Georgia fans who were Patriots fans, before Sony Michel got there. So we have in our sort of listener base here, viewer base here, a pretty strong representation of a lot of NFL teams. But just by and large, if you were not a fan of the Patriots would rank pretty high on the most hated teams. And I kind of asked the question of, does that change it for Georgia fans when Isaiah Wynn, who's injured now, but will be healthy soon, when he's there, when Sony Michel's there. Malcolm Mitchell's not there anymore, but at one point in time he was there. Boss Andrews, of course, is the center on that team. Does that change it for some fans? And I get the impression it has for some and maybe not for others. Martico Walker, excuse me, Martico, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. He says, we're going to be a better team next year. I feel like we had a good season this year. If we can run the ball, nobody's going to be able to beat us. And Martico is exactly right, and that's kind of what we're talking about right now. That's one of the things that Georgia's going to look to develop. Matt Rukavina says, my family and I just booked our tickets to Disney World in August. Can't wait to wear Georgia gear all over Central Florida. And yes, Connor will visit the Harry Potter land. So that's kind of nice to know. Hope you guys have a good time there. Jeffrey Horton says, regardless of DGD is going to win the Super Bowl. Go Dogs. Yeah. Is it 7 Georgia players still active in the playoffs?
Yes, all 4 teams that are still alive have a Georgia player on.
That's good to know. James Crump says all coaches lie on the recruiting trail. The ones with the most believable lies are considered great recruiters. James, lie is kind of a strong word to use there. I mean, everybody's got their own spin on every story, right? And I do think that coaches have a responsibility of being as honest as they possibly can be with every conversation they have, no different than anybody else. Really, there's no walk of life where honesty shouldn't be, an expected requirement. People should be honest with each other in their deliberations. But there is a natural tendency to spin. There's a natural tendency to sell. There's a natural tendency to sort of put forth the best case scenario that most benefits you. And so I do think, with that in mind, recruits also have an obligation to measure all the things that they're hearing, measure all the things that they're getting from coaches in terms of, is this the most believable version of events, or is this the version of events that suits them best? Now, you may be referencing the Jaden Hazelwood thing here. I think that the one thing that I would hope an elite 5-star receiver would one day see is that being a part of an offense like Georgia that runs the way that Georgia does, that shouldn't be a negative for a player like Hazelwood. That ought to be a positive, because think about the safeties that are creeping towards the line of scrimmage. You may see this with Dominic Blaylock as soon as next season. A guy like Blaylock who's going to get single coverage a lot just because you've only got 11 defenders on the field. If safeties are creeping up to stop the run, they're not back there to help on those deep throws. And a guy's going to really take advantage of that at UGA at some point in time. I mean, the thing that even with Hazelwood doing some of the stuff he did this weekend, I can't deny, if Hazelwood was at Georgia, I think that would be a really good thing. And I think that Hazelwood's actually going to miss out on an opportunity. The truth is, even though Oklahoma throws it 9 million times a game, I think his better chance for the best possible career was actually at Georgia. Georgia couldn't convince him of that. But I don't think this was a case of Georgia lying to Hazelwood or being, as he suggested, a used car salesman approach towards that. I don't think that's what that was at all. It was just a matter of what Georgia was trying to sell. Hazelwood chose not to believe. But, ultimately he's made his decision, and I hope he's happy with it. Cyranard Watson says, that was one of the top reasons why UGA commits said they came to UGA was the transparency of the coaching staff. That's a good point. We heard that from Tyreek Stevenson on today's show. Think about Stevenson's mom, emotional as she was when her son chose UGA. Think about the depth of conversation that Georgia had with Nakobe Dean over the course of that time. I think that one of the things that Georgia has been pretty good about is that transparency. But it's also important to remember this. Do you remember a couple of months ago, this has actually been probably more than a couple months than that, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, when Jeff asked Hazelwood directly, how has Georgia said they're going to use you? And Hazelwood did not really have a good, clear answer to that. He kind of shrugged it off. This could be an example. There may be no one to blame on this. Georgia's not to blame for this. Hazelwood's not to blame for this. It just sort of seems like Georgia and Hazelwood had a miscommunication, because you can compare that and contrast that to something that Kendall Milton has said. Hey, how does Georgia plan on using you? And he goes into this rich detail of exactly how he fits into Georgia's plans and what he'd do and blah, blah, blah. There are other guys that kind of feel the same way. That seemingly is something with most guys Georgia's pretty good at. Here's how we'll use you. in Hazelwood's case, there was just always seemingly a communication block there. And as I said, I don't know that you blame Georgia for that. I don't know that you blame Hazelwood for that. These two entities, the player and the program, were just not on the same page. Go ahead.
Talk about Dominic Blaylock. I think he's going to be a really, really good wide receiver.
Yeah, listen, I do too.
I think he's going to help Georgia out a lot. He's an incredible athlete. He's already at a young age. He's a very polished route runner, and I think he's going to be a great player for Georgia. And I think Georgia's lucky to have him.
Well, I mean, and you certainly can't deny the contrast between the drama-free Blaylock and other players that seemingly seem to cultivate that drama. Where they go. Blaylock is free of all of that, and I do think it helps the Blaylock case that he had such a big performance in the All-American Bowl. We saw him on TV a lot this past year during his senior season at Walton. I mean, Blaylock brings a lot to the table, and I think he's going to enter the Georgia program as a pretty significant fan favorite there. Elite Baller says Fromm's still developing. We're taking him for granted because he had a mature look to him early. He's still developing. Elite, that's a good point. He was better as a sophomore than he was as a freshman, and if that same progression happens as his junior year, think about how much the Georgia passing game could develop there. Janus Graham on YouTube says leadership, focusing, and finishing need to be in the coaches' and players' minds during the offseason. I think those three things are all, one way or another going to be a big part of the conversation that goes on there. Bruce Hucks is predicting that Blaylock's going to be the better of the two receivers. That'll be interesting to see. Jacob Thompson, the subject of coaches leaving, says that Jim Chaney left because Tennessee threw some money at him. Lincoln Riley's going to be gone when the right NFL job opens up. We'll see about that, see how that goes. Cliff Payne on YouTube says the Dogs' offensive line will be the dominant force that takes UGA to another level, and certainly one way or another, that is that's the profile that Georgia's trying to build its championship hopes around. Now, it may or may not work. 2 years from now, Georgia may just have not gotten over the hump. But this is the strategy that Georgia has employed to say, let's get the biggest, best offensive lineman we can find and then build the offense around that. That's one of the reasons why, even with the transition to James Coley, Georgia is not going to play hurry up, no huddle in any kind of exclusive fashion. A lot of people do like the way that Georgia finishes halves at 2-minute drills, always seem to work pretty well. But, Connor, I don't believe you could do that, for 10 possessions during a game. I just think that Isaiah Wilson and Andrew Thomas and Jamari Salyer and guys like that would just get tired eventually.
Right, and there have been a number of examples where if you try to go up tempo and it doesn't work, it tires out your defense.
That's a good point, yeah.
We talked about this on Friday. Yeah. When these Big 12 teams, I think what happens is when you go up tempo and you're not necessarily scoring all the time, you're leaving your defense out there for a long time, and that has very much a negative effect on your defense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. All right, back over to Facebook here for a moment. Mark Cochran says our offensive line was a beast in the SEC game, and they weren't even our starters. It is a good point. Georgia playing, without its what I would think of as its 5 best offensive linemen there in that game. You can go back and watch. That's a group that's holding its own against what I think of as a really good Alabama defensive line, and that's one of those things that ought to give Georgia fans a little confidence heading in this upcoming year. Brad Hodnett says, hopefully we use the tight ends to open up the outside. That was always kind of interesting. I don't really quite know why this was, or if this was just a coincidence. But when Georgia did go into that sort of hurry-up mode near the end of the half, for whatever reason, Isaac Nada always seemed to benefit. The obvious game that comes to mind is the 4 consecutive catches he got against Florida. But a lot of these end-of-half situations, Auburn kind of comes to mind here for a moment as well. When Georgia was going hurry-up near the end of a half, it seems like Georgia did find the tight end a little bit more there in that regard. And obviously finding the tight end a little bit more is going to be an important thing for Georgia moving forward. Heath New on the subject of the other line of scrimmage says we could have used another big body on the defensive line. So, Georgia obviously, recently missed out on Aubrey Solomon's transfer. He goes to Tennessee. But when you look at the overall additions that Georgia's made in its defensive line for the 2019 class, it's one of the reasons why I also think that, as I said off the top of the show, maybe Georgia fans shouldn't be too concerned necessarily about the pursuit of these remaining coaches. When you look at the talent that Georgia's bringing in, the coaches that get to coach are going to benefit from the talent that Georgia has. I think there are a lot of people that really like some of the things that Zion Logue brings to the table, Timon Mitchell brings to the table. These are not necessarily elite names in recruiting circles, but Jordan Davis wasn't either, and Davis has become quickly one of Georgia's most important defensive players. There's some thought that Mitchell and Lowe could be kind of in the same boat. Bill Norton is a guy that is kind of interesting in that regard too. Also, I can't help but think about, when you think about future defensive linemen of the Georgia program, first of all, 2020 is already loaded with them. But, how about the idea that a Justin Rogers, who we've talked about as an interior offensive lineman, a guy that really likes Georgia a lot, sounds like Rogers may be contemplating a position change too, which is kind of interesting to think about, how Georgia could continue to add those big defensive linemen into the program.
Back to your point on Mitchell and Logan, bringing those type of guys in. This time last year, even a little bit later, we weren't talking about Jordan Davis at all. No one wanted to talk about him.
No.
Mammoth guy. And then you see the second half of this year, and then especially in the Texas game, Georgia defense is totally different when he is in the game and when he is not in the game.
Absolutely.
So, those guys that play that type of position, they're usually not 5-stars because the way the ranking systems work, you don't see NFL teams taking, massive run stuffers in the first round of the NFL draft. That's why those guys don't often get rated as 5-star players.
That's exactly right. Zach Smith on the other side of the ball also bringing up Kearis Jackson is kind of an underrated sleeper of that wide receiver core. There's something about Jackson I've kind of always really liked. He's that guy that probably plays the slot receiver position for you, but he's kind of built a little bit like a running back. I think that Jackson is an interesting name to observe, especially during spring practice, to see how much development he's shown. Because remember, after his freshman season, going back to 2017, I'm not so sure you expected to ever see J.J. Holloman doing anything at Georgia. Just to be honest with you, Holloman was a sort of a non-factor as a freshman. I think for a lot of people, they kind of moved on to other names. And as a sophomore, Holloman showed you that he had taken that time where he was not really a part of the offensive game plan too much and spent that time, put that time to good use, developing himself to where he became, one of Georgia's top receivers here this past season. I'm not telling you Kearis Jackson makes the same kind of leap, but let's not make too many assumptions about a guy because we haven't seen him playing a ton and involved in the offensive game plan very much. Behind closed doors, away from the watchful eye of the media and cameras, J.J. Holloman was growing and developing, and Kearis Jackson could have had the same thing happening with him. Charles Felder also bringing up Tommy Bush as the future of the Georgia receiving corps. Bush is one of those guys, a little bit like Nate McBride's always been, who's just a very popular person in comment sections, both here on our live shows and at the forum at forum.dawgnation.com. And I understand where it comes from when it comes to Tommy Bush. He's just got the build, right? He's a fast guy that's also got some height to him. There's a lot you can do with that, and I'd love to see him get a chance. Kenneth Dana Barfield says James Cook is the most versatile tool on offense. There's certainly a lot of different things you can do with him. I think right now Georgia needs, from my perspective, Cook to be less of that sort of versatile, a Swiss Army knife. And I think that for now, Georgia needs to really view James Cook as a true running back. Hopefully he can fill that role for Georgia as one of its top 3 for 2019. And hopefully, we haven't talked a lot about the James Cook injury because, most of that happened during December when there wasn't a whole lot to see. A lot of that kind of stuff happened, away from, there weren't a lot of reporters around necessarily. Hopefully the next time, Kirby Smart kind of previews the 2019 season, hopefully we get a positive outlook for Cook because, Connor, I think you saw him in New Orleans. He was, completely wrapped up on the one leg on that.
And a scooter cart.
Yeah, he had the little scooter cart thing. And the truth is I have no idea, what that means necessarily, but it's important to note that he was pretty well wrapped up there, and because it was December and because it's Texas and the Sugar Bowl, not that much attention was paid to it. How much would have really played anyway? But his health status is going to be a pretty important update to get at some point in time too.
Right. Yeah. Depending on how serious that injury is, and his brother Dalvin is someone who had some lingering injuries. Obviously, he had the torn ACL last year, but Cook is a guy. So I know Patriot talk might not be the most popular thing, but you look at a guy like James White, how he's used. He's a running back by trade, but the way he's used in the passing game really helps open things up for the Patriots offense. And I'd kind of be excited to see him sort of get used in that James White role, whereas DeAndre Swift might be the Sony Michel role as like a primary runner who can also occasionally catch passes, but in the passing game, you're looking at Cook in that.
Well, Jeremy Chapman made an interesting point along those lines too, kind of comparing him to what Percy Harvin was like at Florida. I think the problem is when you look at Georgia at its best in 2017, when, it was going to the college football playoff. You had a lot of carries going to Chubb, a lot of carries going to Michelle, but you had a decent number of carries. I think he had 300 yards rushing going to DeAndre Swift as well. There is some room at Georgia for that number 3 running back to really be an important player. Swift, for instance, had the not the game-winning touchdown, but the touchdown that put the SEC championship on ice back in 2017. So I understand the idea of the flexibility and the ways that you can use Cook, but I also believe that as it stands right now, given Holyfield's departure, Georgia's looking to fill out its sort of 3-man roster there, the running back position, and I think Cook fulfilling that duty would be his highest and best use. That it does indeed happen.
Right, and I think another thing to monitor with the UGA running back situation, a lot of people are obviously excited about Zamir White. How much of a workload is he going to be able to take on next year? Because the role Georgia kind of needs him to fill is that bruiser. He's going to carry the ball 20 times. He's going to get you 5 yards a carry for 100 yards. They need someone, because I think Swift is at his best when he's 15 to 10 carries, and you're sort of getting him involved in different ways. Whereas I think White is a guy who will come in and soften up the defense. And I wonder with his knee injuries, how much he's going to be able to do that.
So here is statistically why I'm optimistic about Zamir White. If you want to go back and look at Nick Chubb in 2016, behind, with all due respect, an inferior offensive line, the offensive line that Georgia is going to have in 2019, and with Chubb clearly not 100%. He was not the same player in 2016 that he had been pre-injury 2015, certainly going back to his freshman season in 2014. Even with that said, Nick Chubb still went for 1,100 yards in 2016. So Zamir White, who presumably has had less of a devastating injury, playing in front of a better offensive line, and certainly there's no problem with Zamir White in terms of what kind of prospect he was before the injury took place. I don't think it's unrealistic to think that Zamir White could go 1,100 yards next season.
Certainly, and if he's as talented if he's as good as everyone thought he was going to be coming in, and sort of what we know about his knee injuries, they weren't super significant ACL tears. I know all ACL tears kind of scare people now, but the science with those has gotten better. We've seen plenty of guys come back in short periods of time. Adrian Peterson in 2012 had a much more significant ACL tear. He ran for 2,000 yards the next year and won NFL MVP. So it's not also while you can be concerned, you can also have some optimism that he's going to be able to bounce back.
Hashim Spikes on YouTube also reminds us, don't forget, Kenny McIntosh is going to be a bruising running back. Got to use in those short yardage situations, which also brings me to something that Cliff Payne said on YouTube, that those red zone struggles in the LSU game are why Jim Chaney just needed to move on. Dogs need better in-game adjustments and more creativity. What's kind of funny is Cliff Payne uses the word red zone in terms of the place where Georgia has offensive issues. I think we all know what he means by that, but the honest truth is it wasn't 20 and in, or even as like the stat gurus define it, kind of like the 40-yard line and in where Georgia had its issues. It was really at from the 5-yard line and in. And even, as you got closer to the goal line, Georgia became more inept offensively. And as I've referenced on DawgNation Daily before, there are people who put the blame for that right there on Jim Chaney, that he wasn't creative enough there in those regards. That, as I think Bill Walsh has pointed out in one of his old books, that it's really that willingness to pass down near the goal line that's a requirement. Otherwise, you become very easy to defend, especially for Georgia, who likes the bunch formations, wide receivers kind of close to the offensive line. When you don't have a very deep field to work with, you do have to be more creative there. So, Connor, one of the things I do think is going to be interesting to see how James Coley evolves in that regard. Now, I sort of think that Georgia actually got better at that as you went towards the end of the season, but they also didn't play a lot of very, very good teams in that regard. It's the UMass, it's the Georgia Techs of the world against Alabama. I honestly don't remember what the goal line numbers ended up being, but it will be very interesting to see if James Coley is a little more creative there with those goal line offensive plays. The one statistical area which I do think you have enough definitive evidence to point to Jim Chaney and say he wasn't good enough in that regard.
Right. I think we're seeing now creativity when you get into those goal-to-goal situations matters. To give another NFL example, the Dallas Cowboys, great running back in Ezekiel Elliott. Dak Prescott is sort of a bruiser. Someone who, when they want to run him, he can get those yards. They have a great offensive line. The Cowboys ranked 29th in the NFL this season in touchdown percentage in the red zone at 48%.
Mm-hmm.
I think creativity and designing ways to get guys in there is something that's often overlooked because while it's great to have these massive offensive linemen and great running backs, you can't always just expect, oh yeah, we're just going to mash our way into the end zone, especially in that area where when the defense can just really shorten the field and stuff more bodies in than you can put on the offensive line.
Robert Barnes says I haven't heard one mention about Brian Harry, and we have talked about Harry, coming off the Sugar Bowl, because I think it's certainly fair to say with Harry and seemingly coming back and him showing up and being really impressive in New Orleans against the Longhorns, that Harrion should be considered a part of this competition for playing time next season. So I think if Harrion is a name you haven't heard as much as you want on the comment section as of late, by the time you head towards spring practice, I'm guessing we will be speaking about Harrion a good bit more. I don't know if he wins that competition for more playing time, but in terms of being a threat to take it from somebody else who wants it, I would definitely think that Brian Harrion is certainly in the mix to potentially do that. And one of the things I'd also like to see from the Georgia offense in terms of, its issues near the goal line, I just think it's just in general more difficult to score down there. I love the idea of Georgia continuing to find ways to avoid that scenario altogether and scoring before it gets there, which does mean that, I do want, James Coley to feel very comfortable, taking advantage of some of those favorable secondaries when you are forced to do things to stop the run. I'm hoping that James Coley feels some comfort to really try to exploit that. And to me, that's always going to be the missing piece of that Georgia offense. You look at national champions. They all have at least one player who's got 900 yards receiving. That's just one of those statistical things that the college football playoff era has seemed to brought us. An elite receiver is a part of every national championship team. Georgia had a collection of good receivers a year ago, but the highest, most productive receiver on the Georgia roster didn't even have 600 yards. Both Riley Ridley and McCole Hardman leave both fewer than 600 yards receiving this past season. I'd love to see James Coley, especially for a guy like that that's got some experience with wide receivers. I'd love to see him sort of cultivate one of these guys, whether it's a returning player like Holloman or a newcomer like Blaylock. I'd love for him to see him find some way to turn somebody into something close to a 1,000-yard receiver. That's really the next development for a Georgia offense that, statistically speaking, has done almost everything. That's the one thing in the Kirby Smart era they really haven't done as of yet.
I mean, that's the thing that really hasn't been done a whole lot in Georgia's entire history.
That's true.
They have one 1,000-yard receiver in the program's history. Shout out Terrence Edwards. Yeah, I mean, part of it is so Georgia will have the opportunity to open it up a little bit more now that Jake Fromm's really immersed and that he is the guy.
Hold on, time out for 1 second. I love Terrence Edwards as much as anybody, but isn't it Malcolm Mitchell that went over 1,000 yards?
No, it's Terrence Edwards.
Are we sure about that?
Yeah, he's 1,008 yards.
Okay. Mitchell had to be over 900 at least.
I can look this up. I don't know if he ever did.
I don't want to shortchange Terrence Edwards because we're obviously huge fans of his. While you're looking that up, Troy Sadowski says that with the offensive line, and Troy's obviously, as many of you remember, a great tight end at Georgia back in the late 80s. But Troy says with the combination of running backs that Georgia has and the offensive line talent that returns, they've got the potential threat of running for 3,000 yards. And I certainly understand where he's coming from on that. That is certainly a pretty impressive collection of talent they've sort of put together there in that regard.
Yeah, Malcolm Mitchell, his highest total was a senior year. He had 865 yards.
Which by typical Georgia standards is actually really, really high.
Yeah,
because even Javon Wims, who had a big year for Georgia in 2017, he topped out at just over 700 yards. So the Mitchell year is even kind of bigger than a lot of that kind of stuff.
That's with Grayson Lambert as his quarterback, and Fatone batted for a game.
Yeah, so
we'll never speak of again.
Right. I'm gonna refrain from commenting on that one way or another. But yes, indeed. All right, we're going to get ready to wrap up here. Chad Williams was Terrence Edwards, so I apologize for giving our buddy Terrence Edwards less than full credit that he deserved for a big-time season in a Georgia uniform there. All right, let me get one or two more, and we'll get ready to get out of here.
I do have an interest. We were talking a lot about Harrion. We were talking about Harrion a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has over 100 rushing yards in the spring game.
It'd be very interesting. That's a guy that played pretty well in the spring game a year ago, I think, didn't he? Or was that Holyfield?
I think it may have been Holyfield.
Yeah, but I could see him stepping up and kind of showing that off. Now, the other thing is that Kirby is, he's one of those guys that sort of goes with a very limited playbook sometimes in the spring game. So, which by the way, I guess is going to be April 20th, courtesy of our friends at the UJ Alumni Association. But so I don't really know what you read into the G-Day game too much, but I could definitely see Harry and have a pretty good day there. Let's see. All right. We are going to get ready to get out of here. Thank you all for a great day on the program today. We'll have more on DawgNation both at the forum at forum.dawgnation.com, the video channels, and dawgnation.com itself when big news happens. And there's going to be some big news in the days ahead as Georgia fills out its coaching staff. And by the way, there's still some recruits out there on the board for 2019 as well. So we're going to cover all of that. And, of course, we'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live. Y'all have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.